Hi quilters, welcome to the 15th video in our series of projects to use leftover 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. The pattern we're using today is called the Jiffy Jelly Quilt. We'll provide a link to the pattern in the description below. This pattern calls for full strips, so a sorting of my remaining strips was necessary to find long enough pieces to use for this quilt. More on the sorting at the end of the video. Once I found the pieces I needed, I pressed my strips and then it was time to cut. You can cut one strip at a time or cut multiple strips at once. I'm stacking 2 strips on top of each other and using my 6.5-inch ruler. So each strip has 2 layers. From each layer, you will need to cut 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches and 3 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From each fabric strip, you will get 4 rectangles that are 2.5 by 6.5 and 6 squares that are 2.5 by 2.5. Stack as you cut into 5 separate piles. A folded jelly roll strip will give you enough pieces to make 2 full blocks, but really you can use any length strip as long as it's at least 21 inches long. 1 half strip will equal 1 block. If you'd like the cutting to go a little bit faster, you can still stack strips, but make 4 wide instead of 2 wide, and then use a 12.5-inch ruler to cut the pieces. I cut all of the strips I found during my sorting. I had already decided to make 1 large quilt or 2 smaller quilts depending on how many strips I found. If you are using a jelly roll, you will get about 80 blocks from 1 jelly roll. So you'll have 40 to 42 strips and you'll get 80 to 84 blocks. If you don't have a jelly roll or pre-cut strips, find yardage to equal about 3 yards of fabric and cut it into strips, and that should be equal to the amount you'd have in a jelly roll. Once all your pieces are cut, take time to sort them into pieces needed for a single block. You will need 2 matching 2.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles with matching squares. Set aside one of the 2.5 inch piles in a separate area to use for the center squares. To those sets, add 1 2.5 inch square of a different fabric for the center square. Pin all the sets together to keep them organized. The sorting of the sets and pinning the blocks together took a little while, but I played some of my favorite songs and had a little dance party, and it went by pretty quickly. Pre-sorting and pinning makes it easier to piece a few blocks at a time, and if you drop a whole stack of pieces, they'll stay together instead of making a big mess. Now it's time to sew. Use 1/4-inch seam allowances. Start by piecing matching squares to opposite sides of the center square piece. I made a small bunch of blocks at one time, maybe 6 to 10 in each batch, just to break it up a little and help me stay organized. By breaking it up into smaller batches, if I have to walk away from it at any point, it's easier to jump right back in and figure out where I left off. Most of the fabrics I used were non-directional, so it didn't really matter how I sewed them together. But a piece like this stripe, I tried to pay attention so that the stripe would run the same way on all of the pieces in the block. You wouldn't have to do it that way, of course. You can do it any way you like, but I knew it would bother me if I saw one of the pieces in the stripe running the different direction. Once pieced and pressed, this center row should measure 6.5 inches long. Once I had a pile of center rows with the 2 squares sewn on to opposite sides of the center square, I'd take them to the ironing board and press away from the center square. Now it's time to piece matching rectangles to opposite sides of the center row. The squares on the opposite sides and the rectangles all need to be the same fabric. I used a variety of prints and colors to make this quilt, but this would be an easy quilt to make for a holiday quilt. Just limit the color palette to a few colors to create a totally different look. For example, red, white, and blue would make a patriotic quilt. Red, pink, and white would be a quilt perfect for Valentine's Day. Red and green would be a Christmas quilt. Black and orange would be a Halloween quilt. Once the blocks are sewn, press towards the rectangles. Other color combinations I think would look really nice would be orange, red, yellow, and brown to make a fall quilt, pink, soft yellow, light purple, and mint green to make an Easter or spring color story, and whites and creams together. Just whites and creams would be simple yet beautiful. You could even make a quilt that's just using one color, but all the different shades of that color, like a blue or a green quilt, but all the different shades. It would also be fun to make this in school colors or team colors for a special graduate, teacher, or fan. If you don't have a bucket of leftover strips to use, you can always raid your stash and cut strips out of yardage that you have on the shelf. A 1/4 yard each of about 14 fabrics would be equal to a jelly roll. Do you recognize any of these fabrics and have them in your stash? Some of these are really old. If you've been watching our 2.5-inch strip videos and other tutorials, you might recognize some of these fabrics from our recent projects. Check our link below for playlists for our strip and charm videos. When all was said and done, I ended up with a total of 203 blocks. I could have decided to make 2 quilts that were both 10 blocks by 10 blocks, so 10 across and 10 down, and they would have measured 60 inches by 60 inches, but I decided I want to make 1 large quilt and 1 small quilt, so the large quilt will be set 10 across by 14 blocks down and be 60 by 84, and the smaller one will be 7 across and 9 down. It will measure 42 by 54. The 6.5-inch rectangles should be horizontal on one of the blocks and vertical on the other, so a 1/4 turn on one of the blocks, so all of the sets the same way. For the larger quilt, I'm going to start using 140 blocks to make 70 sets of 2. I'm going to have 14 rows of 10 blocks, so I will set aside 14 of the sets of 2 and then sew the rest of them into sets of 4. Again, make sure that you're sewing a horizontal 6.5-inch rectangle to the vertical ones. If you have seams that are trying to match to each other, one of the sets is being sewn in the wrong way. So get the seam ripper out, take it out, and re-sew it. Otherwise, every block should be a 1/4 turn from the last block. We're going to do the same thing, sewing sets of 4 into sets of 8. By rotating the seams for the alternating blocks a 1/4 turn, we will avoid matching seams until we're sewing rows together. Now all we have to do is bring back those 14 sets of 2 that we set aside and sew them to the sides of our sets of 8 to get 10 blocks across, and we will have 14 rows of 10 blocks. The beauty of a quilt this easy is that you could make it any size you want just by making more blocks. The quilter math on this one is pretty easy. 1 full strip will equal 2 blocks. For this quilt, I had 200 blocks that I used out of my bucket, so I had used 100 strips of fabric. 100 strips that are 2.5 inches wide equals 250 inches of fabric, divided by a yard, which is 36 inches. I used 6.944 yards of fabric. So between the 2 quilts that I'm making out of that yardage, I got 2 quilts out of almost 7 yards of strips. When pressing the rows, press towards the full rectangles. To make it easy on myself when pressing the longer strips, I will lay 2 across the length of my ironing board so I can press 2 of them at once. As you finish pressing, find a place where you can lay out the quilt top to see the rows together. I rearranged a little bit as I was putting the rows together just to keep blocks that were alike away from each other. although I did end up with a few that were kind of kitty corner from each other as I sewed it together. Once I decided on the order of the rows, I marked them with clothespins numbered 1 through 14. Each of these clothespins is on the right side, so they're always on the same side. I also take pictures with my cell phone to help me in case a clothespin falls off. It's a great backup. Remember that the only seams you need to worry about matching are at the corners where the blocks will meet each other. So if you're sewing seams in between blocks, you need to turn the row the other way. I highly recommend pinning the rows at the corner seams before sewing the rows together. This will prevent the blocks from stretching. Press the rows to one side. I usually press the seams flat first and then press them to one side. It seems to go a little easier for me when I do it that way. And then I pressed after each row was sewn. Sew rows together so you have sets of 2 and then sets of 4, and then you'll have just a few seams left. Once your quilt top is put together, you want to give it one nice pressing at the end before you layer it with quilt batting and backing, quilt it, and bind it. I used my long arm quilting machine to quilt it in a stipple pattern with an ecru colored thread to help it blend into the background. I raided my strip bucket to make bindings for both of the quilts in this video. I just sewed my pieces end to end to get the length I would need. I paid zero attention to the colors of the strips. It was just completely random. I used about a total of a yard to make both of the bindings for the quilts. I used my diagonal seam tape to help guide me for these seams and press my seams open. I sew the binding to the front side of the quilt, press it, and clip it into place so that I can top stitch it from the front to catch the back side with the bobbin thread. This bigger quilt finished at 60 inches by 84 inches. The 63 remaining blocks were made into a smaller quilt that was 9 rows of 7 blocks. I used the same techniques to make the rows for the smaller quilt. The only difference was the odd rows, there were 5 of them, they needed to start and end with vertical 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch rectangles. The 4 even rows started and ended with horizontal 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch rectangles. This smaller quilt measured 42 inches by 54 inches. The backing was pieced from leftovers from a backing from another project. It was great to use up that leftover fabric. This was also quilted on my long arm quilting machine using the same thread as I used on the big one in a spiral and circle pattern. I've been wanting to try out this pattern for a while, and this was a great quilt to practice on. I put the binding on by machine for the smaller quilt also. Now for the update on my strip buckets. I started out with 3 buckets this month, but now I'm down to 2 thanks to some organization. The top box contains very small bits and pieces and some parts of blocks. I have a plan for this and I hope it works. I sorted some of the fabric into 7 bags, so each bag has strips of a certain kind. The first bag contains all browns and background strips for a future strip project. This second bag is just a bunch of random pieces, some of which are sewn together end to end. I have a couple of ideas of what to do with that bag, but I need to make a decision on which way to go. This third bag contains blue strips and sewn strip sets, some of which contain a blue fabric. This bag contains only batik strips. This bag contains bindings from other projects that were lost, and so then we use something else, but they can be bindings for a new project, or I can incorporate them into some other kind of project. This bag contains all different colors of kid prints. This final bag contains all flannel prints and homespun fabrics. Once I had separated out these 7 bags of fabric that I want to use for specific projects, the big bucket is now only half full of random strips, and the 7 bags fit in the very top of the bucket. Now for a quick trip down memory lane. This is how it all started back in April of 2023. After an initial sorting through the bin to plan projects, I had 7 boxes and bins to work with, and now finally I'm down to 2. It's taken 15 videos and over 20 quilts to get it down to these 2 buckets, and I'm really happy about that. I've got more work to do on my strip buckets, more quilts to make, so keep watching for the next strip video. We hope that you will remember to hit the like button, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!